Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us here on another podcast this week. On today's episode, we're joined by my buddy Kevin Klein-Dentz, and we're going to be talking all things archery and competitive archery. Kevin and I have had the opportunity to get to know each other over the last 2 years through our archery club, Lincoln Park Archers, in Towacco, New Jersey, right? And he's actually been a very big part of my journey into learning how to shoot a bow more efficiently or more what's the word I'm looking for? Consistently. Actually, you were there when I started shooting the thumb button. So, Kevin, why don't you take a chance to just introduce yourselves to listeners, tell them a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so my name's Kevin K. I've been shooting a bow since I was about probably 4 years old, maybe 5 years old. Always wanted to hunt. My family owns a property in upstate New York. So my whole life I've been around hunters. Legally couldn't start hunting until I was 12, but all the way from when I started shooting a bow to when I turned 12, I never lost interest. So once I turned 12, I started hunting, got addicted to just bow hunting in general. Found myself shooting a bow a lot because of it, just practicing at 20, 30 yards, but I wanted to take it kind of a step further. So then I looked into competitive archery when I was around probably 13, shot 14, 15, 16 years old. Then when I hit around 17 years old, I found myself getting podium in a lot of competitions all up and down the East Coast. Started getting a tiny bit more recognized by just people around the area. That's when I met one of my buddies, Tyler, who's really big in the archery industry. And then when I was about 17 years old, I signed a contract with George Riles, who basically helps kids who have been in the archery, the competitive archery world for a long time, or a decent amount of time, that have just been constantly shooting and training and kind of getting their level higher and higher. Once they hit a certain level, he gives them a contract and travels with them, and that's when I was introduced to bigger competitions. That was about 3, 4 years ago, and ever since then, I've just been traveling the country, just shooting every big nationals, worlds that I can.
Man, that's quite the jump and actually pretty small span of time.
Yeah.
I mean, going from just picking up a bow around 12 you said, and then by the time 15, 16 years old you're shooting competitive. I mean, that's pretty cool. So what we want to get into today is kind of just start to break down a little bit of this competitive archery game, right? We've all kind of seen like people shoot archery on TV and stuff, but what we don't get to see is the preparation that comes behind it. And I think that there's a link that could be made from competitive archery and preparation to hunting archery and preparation.
Yeah.
So you kind of talk to us a little bit about how you got into archery. So tell us a bit about your team. How do you guys practice? How do you prepare for the competitions, or kind of get people from, okay, they've been shooting for a while and they're okay, but now we're going to work on getting you nailing it?
Yeah, so the biggest jump in competitive archery is definitely going from shooting alone or with buddies or shooting locals to like the big events. So that's kind of the biggest thing we focus on when we contract a newer kid, because 99% of the time they haven't shot like the big Vegas shoot or Lancer Classic or anything like that, where there's thousands of people shooting a day. The biggest shoot they've shot is just their local range, league, whatever. So the biggest thing we work on is the mental, because we try to sign kids. Like when I signed, I had already been hitting 300s in on like a Vegas face. That's where we try to get the kids, is we try to get them contracted around them, so we can focus on the really tiny bits of form where when they already have about 99% of their form down. But now we can fix their mental. So the main thing we train on is being able to take our form 30x game form at home and being able to bring it to Vegas and just do the same thing. So the way we work on that is putting ourselves in somewhat similar situations. So once or twice a year, we have a camp down in Georgia where we're stationed out of its archery learning center. And what we'll do, especially during what's called Christmas camp, which is the week after Christmas, we get all the hornets and black hornets. Black hornets are like the tier up hornets.
Oh.
We get them down to Christmas camp. We shoot for a week in front of people that are better than you, basically. Surrounding yourself around people that are better than you so you can ask for help. They can point things out. Of course, George Riles is down there, so he's able to point things out. And then at the end of the week, we do this big shoot. A lot of people, it's a very, it doesn't seem like much, especially when you first show up. Uh, then, so basically the day before we'll shoot like a qualification round, just a 300 round Vegas. Then, so that's kind of like the first step in the mental game, being able to shoot not just around people, but score around people and worry about your score. Usually that brings kids down from what they're normally shooting. Usually that brings them down about 5, 6 points their first time, which is a gigantic jump. They'll shoot a score that they haven't seen themselves shoot in 3 or 4 years, just because the stress that they haven't really. It's like shooting at a deer for the first time, basically.
The stakes are high.
Yeah. And then the next day which is usually New Year's, we'll do competition. So we'll take the qualification in the order whoever shot, and then the two lowest kids will go against each other. Whoever wins that will move up, and it's just kind of like it's called elimination. So you can move your way up the bracket.
Pretty cool.
So then it gets you used to not just the scoring around people, but now shooting in front of just one on one with a bunch of people watching you. There's live streams going on with sometimes 3,000 people watching it. There's lights going everywhere. I don't know if you've seen the videos of it. There's
No.
blinding lights bouncing off your target. I remember when I first did it, my pin just disappeared, right? Just because of the light contrast.
Sure.
My pin just disappeared off the target. Yeah, so it definitely builds it definitely builds you up for future, but so that's usually the best thing we can do for training mental game at least.
So you pretty much just take them, create the same kind of atmosphere and the same kind of scenario, throw them to the wolves, and you either sink or swim kind of deal.
Yep, that's exactly it.
That's awesome. I mean, that works in so many different things too. I mean, it's the same thing with hunting. Angel and I
Yeah,
were just talking about it on a previous podcast. Sometimes, for especially for these listeners that are just starting off, sometimes you got to just get in the woods and try it out.
yeah,
Sometimes you have to see what doesn't work to start to figure out what does, and you don't figure that out unless you get in there and you start doing it. Now, Angel, I know you had some questions for him about kind of like pre-shot execution, post-shot execution, and stuff. So, what do you got for him?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that we talk about with our viewers and listeners is about keeping everything simple, right? So we're hoping to reach out to a lot of newer people. There might be some people who are looking to get back to basics because some of the things they're doing aren't working. So when it comes to bow hunting, we know that there's a lot of moving parts, and someone who's just getting into it, they might be getting out to the target range, they might be shooting, they might be close to kind of getting good groups, but what would be something, and a lot of you'll hear a lot of people who are bow hunters, they'll say that they have a pre-shot process or a post-shot, something that is helping them lock on to the same spot every single time, whether it be a hold or whatever. Just maybe you could talk about your pre-shot and shot process.
yeah. So with competitive especially, there's pre-shot. The number one thing with archery is consistency. If you have your arrows touching each other at 80 yards, but a foot to the left, that wasn't you, that was to the left. You click your sight and it's in the center. So the number one thing is consistency. If you have one high, one low, one left, and one right, then there's nowhere to move. You have to fix that. But the pre-shot and post-shot thing is definitely the easiest to kind of figure out with competitive archery because you have the exact same target every time at the exact same range, same situation. So the only tough part with hunting is it's different every time. So I find um, there's a saying by Mike Tyson where he's like, "You have a plan until you get punched in the face." Um, that's exactly what I use for like the hunting situation. You have like this whole post shot process of being like, okay, I'm gonna hold with this word in my head. I'm gonna put my pin on this spot in the deer, and then all of a sudden it's 6:30 in the morning, freezing cold, and your first hitless buck steps out in the bow range. That disappears immediately.
Yeah.
So I think the biggest thing with figuring out a post this is bow hunting wise at least. The biggest thing with figuring out a pre and post shot process with bow hunting is just putting yourself in different situations, practicing out of your tree stand. Because, for instance, when you're on the ground and you're shooting at a target indoors, you draw back, you bring your pin down to the middle, you bring your anchor down to your face, and then I start like a word process basically, which is kind of just gets my timing in motion. So if you put three videos of me shooting next to each other, hopefully it looks like the same video is basically what you're trying to get. Problem with that in a hunting situation is that deer could either be, if you're in a blind, if the deer's at 20 yards. Next week you might have a deer at 30 yards, but now you're at a tree stand, so now your degree is way different, which can change 50-60% of your form because now your hips are bent. If you're not bending your hips, which is a problem, your anchor can move, your peep can move. Now your bow's not going to hit. It's either going to hit low or high, usually a little high. Um, but definitely with the pre, I think the biggest thing with the pre shot is just telling yourself what's going to happen. So there's a such thing as confidency in archery. Basically, you're just telling yourself it's going to go in the middle. It's like basketball. If you throw a basketball at the rim and not think anything, it's not going to go in half the time. Where if you look at that rim and imagine your basketball going in, it's going to go in a lot more often. It's just kind of like that. If you look at that deer at 25, 30 yards and you say, I'm just going to put my pin behind the shoulder bone and not worry about too much of a form, everything just, if you've practiced enough, everything just seems to kind of settle in. And then the post shot is hopefully the deer running off with a good
Right.
blood trail.
Yeah, so you
And
said a couple things there that I want to touch on.
mhm.
One of them being the anchor points. So, how many anchor points do you have? Do you have one? Do you have multiple? What are the what's where do you get set? Where do you feel comfortable? And do you think that beginners should be worrying about anchor points and how many should they if they use any?
Yeah, so anchor point is probably, in my opinion, the biggest, if not one of the biggest things that you should have in a form. Especially if you're a tree stand hunter or a saddle hunter, because when you're aiming down and you're not bending your hips right, because you're supposed to bend at the hips, you don't want to just move your shoulders down. You got to move your whole body down. Because if you move your shoulder down with your bow, your anchor point's going to move up. So if you only have one anchor point or no anchor point, your bow's not gonna hit where you want it to go.
Yeah.
So, either wounding or missing the deer. So anchor point is probably the most important thing to learn. With my target bow, I have nose, of course the peep always has to be in the middle, and I shoot a four finger fulcrum flex, which is a hinge release. And the way I use it is my jawbone. These two fingers create a V. I lock it right in there. I mainly learned that from hunting, so I can lock it in my jaw line, and whether I'm moving up or down, it's just going to stay in the same spot, meaning my string's going to be in the same spot, my peep's going to be in the same spot, and my bow's going to hit in the same spot.
Yeah. So I have obviously hunters and target shooters are going to be similar in a lot of ways, and one of those ways is the anchor point. And there's a lot of products out there too that can help with this. And
Mm-hmm.
I have a kisser on my bow, and I have
Mm-hmm.
that resting right inside the crease of my mouth
Yep.
when I pull back, and then my knuckle will be right on my jaw, and I will
Yeah.
actually. So I'm using an index release. I'm using a trigger release.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
my hand is inside the sling, and I have that almost as an anchor point as well. So the
Mm-hmm.
way that my wrist is flexed is almost another anchor point as well for me. And then when I get my peep sight settled perfectly, my string will actually touch the very end of my nose. And I know
Yeah.
that if it's not touching the very end of my nose, I'm either to the left or to the right. It's either too
Yep.
much into my nose or it's if it's not touching me at all. But it's so slight. You know what I mean? So obviously when I release the bow, it's not gonna hit my face, but it's
Yeah.
just a slight feeling there. It's almost like it's not there, but it's just really something that really helps me, and it's one of the things that
Yeah.
we think would help new shooters. The other thing that you mentioned that I thought was good was the grouping, right? So a lot of people when they
Yep.
sight in their bow, they sight in their arrows, they're just gonna release an arrow and they say, "Oh, that one was the good one," right? And then
Mm-hmm.
they'll sight their bow in off of that one arrow that they thought was a good shot, and they'll make adjustments. But similar to rifle shooting, I've found that tuning my bow really comes when you take the average of your groups. So, people should really not be, rushing their training. You're going to be out there, and if you want to be effective, the more training you get, the better you're going to be. One of the things that, I've done myself, and it sounds like you might do as well, is I sight my bow in off of, multiple arrow groupings.
Yeah,
Is that
yeah,
something that you also do?
100%. Yeah, I mean, especially when I'm shooting outdoor competitive, I spend days tuning. I shoot, if I can, between 2 and 400 arrows a day during like hard archery season. Um, Mainly because not just to drill my form into my head to where I don't have to think about my form, I just have to think about moving my release and that's it. Um, but the reason that also helps the sighting in factor is because what if you go and sight in one day and the wind was hard left and you have good groups but they're to the left, so you move your sight to follow that. Maybe there's no wind the next day. Maybe the wind's in your face the next day. So if you take like a week, never put on a sight tape in one day. If you're making a sight tape, like if you have a dial sight, never make it in one day. Put your marks on for that day. Then go back some other time in that week to the same range if you can. Shoot it again. Do that 3 or 4 times before you put a sight tape on. Same thing with your pins. If you're gonna sight in your bow 2, 3 days before hunting, there's a good chance that maybe the day that you sighted them in, it was hard left right wind and you didn't really notice it too much. Sometimes you don't feel wind at all and it's still there, especially depending on the speed of the bow you're shooting. No one realizes if the wind's in your face, that can actually make the arrow go 2 to 3 inches lower past 40 yards, which at a deer at 40 yards is a big difference because of how much they can move at that distance from a bow. So if you're hitting 3 inches high at 40 yards and you don't realize it and you go to shoot a deer at 40 yards, that deer doesn't have to duck as much as it did if your bow was sighted in. So definitely spending time with your marks, whether it's indoor even because your form can be different one day than the other, outdoor because of the wind, whether it's hunting or target, you definitely got to spend several days on your
Yeah, I mean, form can be different, like you
yeah.
said, in many different aspects of hunting, right? So there might be
Mhm.
an issue, there might be a situation where, let's say, you're going in for an afternoon hunt and you're going to your stand and you see a deer and it's a deer that you want to harvest and you never even made it to your tree. You might have to
Mhm.
take a shot from the tree, from the floor
Yep.
that, if you were practicing from the tree stand the whole time because you anticipated hunting from the
Mhm.
tree, now you got a different shot. Or
Exactly.
maybe, you went for a couple hunts and you didn't see anything and you're like, hey, I got to move my stand. You go into the woods and you've been tracking in and you've got gear on your back and now you're gassed, right?
Mhm.
And now you finally make it to your tree and that's a day that you see a deer that you want to harvest and now you're way more worked up and you've got way more stress and you've fatigued yourself way more, so anything you can do to practice over a longer
Yeah.
period of time is definitely going to benefit you for sure.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Now, continuing on that topic of practice and preparation, obviously, as similar as competition and hunting archery is, there's obviously a lot of differences too, right? So when you're shooting competition archery, and we have our little league
Mhm.
at our club, and you shot things as little as that and as big as, like you said, Vegas. And I know, like, when we shoot the league, we're shooting at spot targets. And for those
Mhm.
listeners and viewers that don't know what those are either 5 spot targets where you have 5 different circles to shoot at, 1 arrow per circle, or you can have a 1 spot, right? Which is we use a little bit. I think that's more of like the
Recurve.
low,
Yeah.
yeah, like recurve traditional type stuff. And then there's, I think Vegas is a 3 spot where there's three
Mhm.
different circles.
Mhm.
So essentially, if you're shooting a 5 spot, you're shooting 5 arrows, and if you're shooting a 3 spot, you're shooting 3 arrows. Now, tell us a little bit about what it's like when you step up to the line. When you step up to the line to shoot those arrows, do you get as much time as you want to shoot those arrows? Are you timed? Do you have to take each individual shot within so much time? Like, what's that look like once you step up to the line? And then we're going to use that and relate that to what it looks like in the
Mhm.
woods later on.
Yeah. Well, so the nice thing with competitive archery, and it stresses a lot of people out when they're first starting, especially, is the timer. There's of course a timer going off, whether you're in the finals or not, just qualifications, there is a timer. So one good thing to do is put that timer on your phone. They make apps that have all the organizations' timers, NFA, USA, whatever, World Archery. If you put the timers on your phone, practice with that, you'll realize that, I think USA was 120 seconds this past season. I was finishing with 40 seconds left.
Wait,
Like, no one, it was very rare, maybe one archer on the line with 10 seconds left, but usually everyone was off the line by 20 seconds. They're not trying to rush you. They're not. That's not part of the competition. That's trying to mess up your mental. That's just to keep it moving because there's so many people there.
Sure.
Last year there was 3,600 archers at Vegas, and they could fit 100 on a line. So it was like, yeah. So it's just to keep it moving. The nice thing with Vegas is the round's like a 45-minute round, so
Okay.
they can get But if there was no timer, it would be probably an hour and a half, two
Hours.
hour line. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's not to stress you out, it's to keep you moving. So definitely practicing with a timer. What I try to do is don't worry about the timer. It's not a thing. It doesn't beep until you're on or off the line, or it doesn't beep when you're on the line at all. It beeps before you're on the line to tell you to go up. I'm off the line. I'm off the line before it buzzes to tell you to stop shooting. I
Okay.
think most everyone is. The thing with timing when it comes to your actual shooting itself is up to you. Or do you want to take 10, 20 seconds in between each shot, or do you want to click your arrow in right away afterwards and keep going? Personally, not in like a rushing manner. I go right away. If I shoot a good feeling shot and it's in the middle of the X and I know it, and I don't even have to look in my binos to see if it was in or not, I click an arrow in and I draw back again right away because that 20 seconds sometimes you can second guess yourself. Okay,
Yeah.
that was left or right X, maybe I should click, you know. Whereas if you just click an arrow in and draw back again, that form is just fresh in your mind. You know what you did that first shot that made it good, and you can do that the second and third shot.
Yeah, and I'm very much the same way, whether I'm
Mm,
practicing or shooting in a league or whatever the case is. Kind of the same thing with golf. You take a couple practice swings, and when you get that one swing that feels great, you step up to the ball and you swing it because that's the freshest in your mind, and
yeah,
you wanna replicate that. So obviously, when you're practicing for your competition, you're shooting at spot targets. What
yeah.
does your practice look like when you start to transition from your competition season into your hunting season? Are you still shooting at paper? Are you shooting at different types of targets? What does that look like?
So the only time I shoot a paper is when I'm making a sight tape.
Okay.
If I can, I'll shoot 3D courses with the hunting bow. No one realizes how good tack is. Tack is really good. Total Archery Challenge is a really good tool. I mean, I would consider it like a training tool because me and my buddies did it. I think one of my buddy, me, had like two of my teammates and another buddy did it. Two of them wore Vans. I was a little more prepared. One of them didn't have a backpack. I had a backpack with water in it.
Sheesh.
There were times where there was a good 15 to 20 minutes of just walking until you shot another 3D target. I mean, it took us 6, 7 hours to get through 25 targets.
Okay.
And that was the hardest course. But the nice thing with that is, it's not the kind of thing where you walk to a tree stand, sit there for 5 hours, and then shoot a deer. You walk for 20 minutes, and then now you have a moose target at 85 yards across a pond that you have to shoot at with a heavy backpack on. We
Right.
don't take our backpacks off because you don't really do that in a hunting situation. And I know a lot of people just do tack just for the like training aspect as it. Um,
S-
Sorry, go on.
Sorry. No. So, not to cut you off, but you had just said that when you're shooting your competition, you really like to just shoot one arrow after another. When you have a great shot,
Mhm.
you want to keep going because you want to replicate that as many times as you can. Do you find it more, I don't want to say more difficult, that might be the wrong word, but do you find it harder to replicate those shots having those 15 minutes between shots? Because I always say whenever I go to a range, especially 3D, whatever it is, the most important shot to me is the first shot. Because when I go in the woods, I
Yeah,
only get one shot. And
yeah,
we were
well, yeah,
talking, yeah, and we were talking recently about if that's the case, then one shot take off your knees, and another
mm,
shot sit down, and another shot maybe swing, go off a tree stand or whatever the case is. So how do you find that changes your consistency if it does at all?
So the only reason it's hard to answer if it changed my consistency is because that first target might have been at 45 yards, quartering toward broadside on flat land, or just quartering toward on flat land, whereas the next target 15 minutes later might be a 72-yard shot across a pond, straight uphill or downhill. Um, Whereas if I did it in more of a setting which I do, where the first shot is 45 yards, flat broadside at a 3D target. Then 20 minutes later, it's the exact identical shot. I'd be able to answer that a little easier, but it's tough
Okay.
to answer it because the conditions are so different. There might be wind. We were hiking up the whole time, So as we were going up, we went from tree line to above tree line. So it went from
Okay.
0 wind to like 30-mile-an-hour wind in one target. So that changed a lot too, of course.
Sure.
You know.
For those of you who don't know what TAC is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but because I've never been there before, wanted to go this year, but once I realized like it was a sign up thing and places fill up, it was a little too late. But from what I understand, TAC is it's a bunch of different archery courses set up by different vendors, I guess,
Mhm.
if you will, and they're usually held on ski mountains, ski resorts, if I'm not mistaken, and they're meant to not only replicate realistic scenarios, they tend to replicate the extremes of those
Mhm.
scenarios. So very steep downhill, very steep uphill, maybe off the side of a ridge, brush in the way, vitals blocked, stuff like that, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's just some courses are harder than others. Some have 15 targets, some have 25. The RMEF ones, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation ones, um, it's just 15 elk, right? Because they only have elk targets on that course.
But
None of them are further than 50. The one we did was the prime course. That was 25 targets, and there I think the furthest shot was 115 uphill. Um, so yeah, it depends on not just your archery skill, but what you're doing. We weren't really preparing for a hunt that hard, you know. I'm just doing bear and deer season this year out of a tree stand on my property, so
sure.
it's just like I wasn't, but it was just for fun. Like let's see what four pro line archers can do on a course like that with a hunting bow. We did good. You know, we didn't really miss, but it was also like there were some shots where our shot would go off, it felt good, and you look in your binos and it's in the butt. So it was a good like eye opener. I mean, some people need that when it comes to shooting for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we had our 3D shoot at the club yesterday, and I took
Mhm.
that one. I think it was like an 85-yard shot at the caribou.
Mhm.
The shot broke, and I was like, "Man, that felt good." Yeah, I heard foam, and we get up there, and it's in the freaking front
Yeah,
leg.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's yeah, definitely. There's that's why it's good whether you're with people or not to whether it's a course or not. At our range, we're lucky because we have like a shed on. We have a 110-yard outdoor range that it goes up to, and we have a shed with a turkey, a bear, and a deer 3D target in it. And when I'm done with a sight tape, after shooting it for a week, I'll throw the bear up or whatever I'm hunting next. And usually people would go 10, 20, 30, whatever their max is. 10, let's say your max is 40, they go 10, 20, 30, 40. Okay, my sight tape's good. I can kill a deer at 40. But you do have the option to go further. We were talking about this yesterday too. If you have the option to go further, there's this thing called a comfort zone. It's pretty self-explanatory. Um, I used to shoot in my backyard where I could only get 15, 20 yards. And I remember when I was like 8, maybe 7, when I got to 15 yards, that was far. Like
Mhm.
15 yards was far. I mean, everyone's felt that at some point. But what I would do is shoot at 20 anyway, because then when I went to 15 yards or 10 yards, it was a lot easier. It was a lot less on your mind. You could focus a little more on yourself, on your form, than how far the target is.
Sure.
So I do the same thing in archery and hunting. If this season where I'm hunting, in the middle of our property, there's a like a swamp pasture thing that goes up. There's one spot where I could get a 60-yard shot off. If I needed to at a big bear, I would do that because I've been spending a lot of time at 100 yards with my bow.
Sure.
Where 60 yards is almost half of that distance, it looks a lot
And I
easier,
mean,
you
you've
know?
made that shot before. I know you were telling me about
Mhm.
that doe you shot, what, last year or 2 years ago? I think it was like a 60, 65-yard shot.
Yeah.
So I mean, when you're practicing, it's the same thing with anything. You know what I mean? You even with dog training, for example. So I have a bird dog, and back in the day when I was in college, I used to run him in hunting competitions, like field trials and stuff like that. And we used to have a saying in the training circuit, and it was always, you want to train your dog harder than the test. Always.
Yeah.
If the
Yeah.
dog only has to hunt for a half hour, train for an hour. If the
Yeah.
dog only needs to search for a duck for 10 minutes, make him search for 30 minutes in training. And
Yeah.
most importantly, always walk away while he still wants more. You want your dog screaming and howling for more as he's leaving.
Mhm.
And a little side note, with kids, that's important too. Like we're always, Angelo and I are always talking about wanting to get the next generation and promote the next generation of growth in our sport. And as a parent or a mentor or whatever you might be to the shooter, it's tough to say, I know you're having a great time, but we have to leave. But at the same rate, if you make them leave when they're still having a good time, they're gonna be begging you to go back the next time, you know? So that's I think that's important. You know, so before I want to go into comparing different like the different setups, target bows, hunting bows, and stuff like that. And before we go into it, I want to talk specifically about those final 30 seconds of a deer walking in. But before we close up the comparison between hunting and target, Ange, do you have anything else you wanna ask or bring up or touch on?
No, the stuff that you guys were just talking about was pretty self-explanatory. It can be different whether you're going to be just shooting indoors, outdoors, whether your training facility allows for indoors. You might have the elements completely taken out of your practice. So it's definitely important to try to find places where you can either extend your shot or just, change up what you're being subjected to. So if there's any way that you can do that, I would definitely seek those places out. If you're a kid and you don't have the ability to drive, see if you can get a mentor or a parent or a family member to take you to one of those places because that could really elevate your game.
For sure. And one last note, we've touched on it in the past, but it's pertinent, I guess, what we're talking about here. We were just doing this yesterday. For the first time ever, I think actually, I didn't score our 3D shoot yesterday. I specifically went out with the only intention was to make a kill shot.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I actually found myself shooting more consistent and I was happier overall with my day because I wasn't worried about getting it in a ring or the small ring or the 10 or the 12 or whatever it was. I want to make a good shot. I know my kill zone area. I want to aim for that. And I would say on probably 90% of my shots, I made those shots. And more importantly, the shots that were within my comfort range, I would say that 30 to 40 yards is probably the max shot I would take on a trophy or something. Maybe 50 yards, I would stretch it out if it was like on a food plot or out in the open or something. But that's where my consistency starts to fade. So I practice more at 60 and 70 like we talked about with the understanding that 50 and under is my kill range. So before we move on, what would you say? We kind of touched on it, I think, but you step up to the line, you got cameras going, lights are flashing, bright lights in your eyes, people screaming, your pins are waving, your pins are disappearing off the target. Well, how does that compare to that 30 seconds when a buck walks out of a clearing and it's this guy you've been watching for 3 years and you didn't have the chance to watch him coming from 100 yards away? Like sometimes you're fortunate enough, but sometimes they really just get on you and you go from 0 to 100 in like a split second.
Yeah.
How does composing yourself in that scenario where it's expected because you're hunting, but it's unexpected because it happens so quickly? How does that compare to being on the line where you've practiced it 100 times, you know what's coming, and you've kind of practiced that?
Yeah, it's unbelievably different. I mean, I know a lot of target, every pro on the line would say the exact same thing. I know pros who miss deer all the time. I know people who hit deer every shot but can't shoot a spot target because it's too consistent, I guess.
Everyone,
Yeah, it's a big difference. I think the biggest thing with the competitive archery is you do technically have the time to prepare yourself for whatever's next. Like Vegas, for instance. I haven't really done much of an outdoor season this year because I've been um, doing a lot of change ups with companies and stuff. So I've more been playing with gear than like really fixing form issues or whatever. But indoor season, probably within the next 2 weeks is when I'll really hash down on like shooting 2 to 500 arrows a day if I can. Um, so Vegas is in February, so I have until from now to February to mentally prepare for it. It's kind of the same thing with hunting, but the problem is you don't know what's going to happen. Vegas, I know I'm going to step up on that line. I know that target's going to be at 18 meters. I know how much time I have to shoot. I know how many people are going to be watching me. I know where the cameras are going to be. I know where I'm going to be. Whereas when you're watching your hitless buck, you could be imagining him like, oh, he's going to step out on my big food plot and all that. But then what if all of a sudden the next day he stops showing up on your food plot and starts showing up in your swamp every day? Okay, well now that's totally swapped? Or what if he shows up behind you and now you got to turn 180 degrees around to try to get a shot through some thicket? Or what if he steps out 10, 20 yards further than you think he's gonna? Or if he's chasing a doe to where, like you said, you only see him 20 seconds before you take him. Or maybe even haven't seen him in person, so maybe he's bigger than you think. So he catches you off guard. I know that happens a lot with the trail cameras, is they don't look as big as
Hmm.
they actually are. So yeah, the big difference is definitely the preparation. I know last year, in when I was down in Georgia shooting that competition, the night before I qualified third out of 40 or however many were there. I knew I had to beat three people to win that competition. I had to beat the fourth placer because he had a chance to shoot against me. I had to beat the second place qualifier, and I had to beat the first place qualifier. And I know what scores they shot. I know how good they are. I know how good they usually shoot. So I know if that maybe that score was low for them. So I knew maybe the next day I was gonna have to go against them when they're even better, or maybe they shot their personal best that day. Maybe the second place qualifier shot his personal best, and I'm like, okay, he shot his personal best yesterday, or it's not gonna happen today. It sounds almost mean, but it's you have the preparation in your head.
Sure.
Whereas again, the deer hunting, it's like there's no saying he's gonna step out at 20 yards broadside in front of my tree stand. That never happens.
Right. It's like almost like you have to plan for an endless amount of possibilities. And I
Yeah,
mean, I think we could all agree here that no matter how much you prepare mentally, and it affects everyone differently, but no matter what, you're going to get that adrenaline spike. You're going to get excited. You're going to lose a little bit of control over your brain, and you have to find some kind of way to bring yourself back and, bring yourself into that. And kind of to just wrap up the whole technical side of shooting and everything. Angelo, you brought up the whole pre-shot process and the post-shot process, and that's where, in my opinion, when it comes to hunting, that's the most important. There's a bunch of different people. I know your coach is George Riles, and I've listened to some stuff by Joel Turner, and both of them will talk about having those things that you're saying to yourself, repeating the same things over and over to just bring yourself back into that shot and make yourself present, so that way it's not, you don't want to rely on your subconscious to do it all. You want to be making those decisions and make sure you're taking that shot the same every time.
yeah,
One more thing I'll add too, though, is because, like you said, you never know what the conditions are going to be, right? So you said there's potentially he's going to be in your field, and then the next time you see him on camera, he's down in the swamps and he's changing where he's staying. So you might have to change where you're hunting from. So one of the things that we talk about a lot is our hunting styles, and Christopher's hunting style varies from my hunting style. And I have a little bit more of an aggressive hunting style. And some of the early season stuff I hunt in, specifically early season, is a lot thicker. And some of the things that I do when I train is I do speed training. So I can assume that you said that when you shoot competitively, you have sometimes a timer, and you usually finish with a lot of time left.
yeah, yeah.
But you're not being rushed, right? So even though there's a timer, they're giving you a decent amount of time. But as we all just spoke from our own experiences, there might be times, like you said, where a buck's chasing a doe, and they might not even actually come to a full stop, and you're
Mhm.
thinking you might have a small window, or
Yeah,
he might be walking away from you, and okay, well, I've ranged him, and he's only going to keep getting farther, and I'm not going to be able to keep ranging him because eventually he's going to get too far. So
mhm.
in the very next window, I've got to take the shot. Do you ever do any speed training? And do you see a benefit to it as far as translating from maybe a non-pressure situation where maybe you're just practicing, or in an indoor facility in a shoot, compared to an outdoor situation where you're not up against a timer, but you have very limited time to execute your shot, and maybe even a very small window to put it in?
Yeah, I think the toughest part with it is figuring out what your time gap is. And it's also like for you, for instance, you're gonna like when I speed shoot, there's you have to do it right. I guess the good is what I'm trying to say. You don't want to just draw back and shoot your bow, because you'll notice if you do that, you'll miss by a foot. You know, the speed shooting is how fast can you put your shot in accurately, not how fast can you just shoot, right? So, for instance, one of my biggest deer I shot, we were following him all the way up from July and the year before too. He kind of made this ridge like his own ridge. We named the ridge on the property after him. It was like mid-October and he disappeared, which wasn't normal for that time because usually he finds his does. It's his territory. He's fighting for his territory. He disappeared, and bucks that he had bumped out earlier in the year were able to move back in. So we switched up some trail cameras, moved them 100, 200 acres away, and we found him again in a completely different area, chasing completely different does. Um, so I found myself hunting him more in the rut. The good thing, the one thing that I believe I did right with that is I mentally prepared myself knowing like, okay, this deer's not going to be at broadside at 20 yards. It's going to be the kind of thing where you're sitting there in the freezing cold and all of a sudden you look up and you see the doe he's been chasing and you have zero time to grab your bow. You got to stand up, draw back quick, and get that shot off, not just fast, but accurately, sometimes maybe even while he's moving. Luckily, I kind of prepared myself for that and did practice getting into my anchor quick and making good, accurate, yet little speedy, rushed shots. Um, because it was November 7th and we were sitting there and I look up. It's like last light, so we had been sitting there all day, 12 hours. We're tired as hell, as you can imagine. We're kind of preparing ourselves to get out of the tree stand, and my dad looks up and sees the doe he's been chasing around, because she was a double throat patch doe,
Cool.
that he's been chasing around, and she was at 40 yards. So I range find her for 40 yards. You can smell the estrus off her too, like she's dripping estrus. So I range find her at 40 yards. I get my bow down. Before I even saw the buck, I didn't hear him, see him, nothing. I just saw this doe. I dialed my sight for 40 yards and waited. She went down the ridge. About 5 minutes later, I saw him come up from up the ridge. He started walking down just on the exact same trail. Before, he was like literally 20 yards, maybe 15 yards out of his trail. I made a noise purposely. I wasn't full draw or anything because I knew if I made a noise when he stepped into, it was a pretty wide gap. It was probably like a 10-yard gap, so it's pretty big. In October, I would have waited until he got into that gap to make the noise because the second you make that noise, their heads up, game over. Whereas in this situation, you make a noise, he ignores you like half the time. So I make a noise, he does nothing. I make a louder noise, he does nothing. He's about 5 yards out of the thing now. I yell at him, like literally as if someone just cut me off on the highway. I yell at him. He takes 5 more steps perfectly out into the middle of the thing, then gets a tiny bit alert, but still doesn't stop. But I see his ears kind of tweak up a little bit or whatever. So I make one more noise. Then he stops and realizes, like, okay, there's something. Keep making noise over there. What is it? Picks his head up and looks at me. He's in the perfect middle of the range, and I was already drawn back, and I got him. But it was like if it was October, I would wait until he just stopped in the middle of that, made a noise, and he would have gotten his head up. So it's also about knowing where you're hunting, what situation you're going to be in. Are you going to be shooting 20, 30, 40, 50 yards, whatever it might be?
Yeah, situational awareness is huge, and
mm,
one of the things I think we touched on in our very last episode was, planning while you're sitting in the tree, right? So when you're target shooting, on the drive over, maybe you're planning your shots, and then when you're hunting, you're walking in, you're thinking about it, or when you're setting up, or when you're already set up, and you're sitting there, and you can turn around, you can say, okay, well, if they come from here, I can do this. If they come from there, I can do that, and there's something to be said about what you just mentioned is, you're looking for a specific doe that that he's courting right now, or maybe he's in a bachelor group and that there's another buck that he's with that's nearby. You figure that he's probably going to be there, so get ready pre-draw. If you know that they're if you can hear them but you can't see
mm,
them, sometimes you have to make those adjustments and you have to
yeah,
make those things. And I'm a concealed carry holder, and in our state you have to be registered to conceal carry. But a lot of the training that I do is a lot of the same stuff. It's you have to draw and be able to execute fast, right? Because a lot of
yeah,
these interactions are happening fast, and it's not like you can just take your weapon out and you can protect yourself to a threat that's far away. It has to be imminent danger, right? So,
yeah,
your reaction time can be very limited. So a lot of the training that I've been doing with that has actually helped me a lot too, because, like you said, you don't want to be inaccurate, right? The last thing we want to do is wound an animal. We also don't want to be, unsafe. So,
yeah,
there's something to be said about speed training, but you have to make sure that you're not releasing your arrow until you're in a set position where
Yeah.
you know that that release is going to be safe. And, you might not be fast in the beginning, but practice and practice and practice, and you're going to continue to shrink that time.
Yeah.
And, when you get into the situation, you're only going to fall back on as much practice as you had. And if you haven't practiced at all, you're really only going to fall back on luck. And you really don't want to have to be doing that with the target buck in your sights.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, if you find that you can't speed shoot that well, just hunt a food plot. I mean, I did that exact thing 4 years ago. I found that I knew where the bucks were coming onto the food plot from, but I knew if I sat that a little further in, if they were chasing a doe, then I knew he would have got, by the time I was full draw, he'd be on the food plot. So I moved my tree stand up onto the food plot where they were coming out from. So when they poked their head out onto the food plot, I drew back there. By the time I was ready to take a shot, they were out on the food plot, wide open, not chasing nothing, eating.
Yeah, and growing up, my dad used to have this saying, and it kind of drove us crazy when we were kids. But the older I get, the more I love it, and to the point where I even share it with my students now. We're always taught growing up that practice makes perfect, and that's not quite.
Yeah,
It's if you're practicing the wrong things, then you're going to reinforce poor habits. So my dad always used to say, "Perfect practice makes perfect."
yeah, yeah,
You got to slow things down to you don't want so basically what we're saying is you want to slow it down to where you're moving as quickly as you can be perfect, and then increase your speed as your skill or your ability starts to increase. And there's something they say in the military: slow is fast, fast is slow. You don't want to move too fast that you put everyone in trouble, but you don't want to move, but by moving slow you're moving quicker because you're eliminating any issues. So with all that said, and with competitive archery and hunting archery being so similar but so different, then I would have to imagine that the gear that you're going to use for both is going to be different.
yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the similarities and differences between for example, the bows that we would use. Like, what specs are you looking for in a target bow when you're going to buy one, and what specs are you looking for in a hunting bow?
Yeah, so target bow, I'm looking for 100% comfort because that's all that matters. If I click with the bow, that's all that matters. It's again like in the military, they say your weapon's your best friend.
Okay.
Like, yeah, the guys you're with are also your friends, but a lot of times they're not going to be the one shooting for you. You're the one shooting the gun still. You're the one shooting the rifle. So it's the kind of thing where your gear is your best friend in that situation. If you're not good friends with your gear at home, you're going to hate it in competition because I guarantee you all the problems will show in competition. I've had it happen to myself multiple times. Whether it's rests getting loose, I had a rest just ruin a nationals for me. Yet I already didn't like that rest before I went. So if I'm not 100% with my gear, I'm not using it. So with a target bow, it's 100% comfort. I don't care if it's loud. I don't care if someone just thought I shot a gun. I don't care if especially during indoor, I don't care if it's slow. I don't care if it's hard to tune. I'll spend days tuning it if it means I'm going to click with that bow.
Great.
If that bow clicks with me, if that bow becomes my best friend, I'm going to shoot it. In a hunting stance, there's a lot more boxes to check off. Is the bow fast, yet will it carry momentum? What's the let-off options? Is it quiet? Is it easy to tune? Because personally, I'm spending so much time with my target gear, I don't want to spend the same amount of time with my hunting bow. I want to build an arrow that I think is going to skip through a rock. Tune it to the bow, get a sight tape, and just be able to put that bow down for a month, and then be able to pick it back up, and the sight tape still be on. So there's a lot more. Obviously you want to be comfortable with your hunting bow, but in my opinion, hunting bows are not comfortable. I mean, the valley pulls. You got to pull through that valley, where
Now, sorry to cut you off. For the listeners who don't know what a valley is, that's at the end of your draw, where there's a buildup or a stack of energy right before the cam rolls over. So you're building, and it's that stiff part that you feel in the back of your draw cycle that you almost feel like you have to get over, and you feel the bow settle back into your anchor point.
Yeah.
Sorry to cut you off there. I just wanted to clarify that for the.
I really enjoy shooting hunting bows, especially the hunting bow I have right now. I click with a decent amount. Like I can, 72 pounds, I can shoot, maybe 80 to 100 arrows out of it before I start getting a little uncomfortable.
Okay.
So it's a fun bow to shoot, but I wouldn't consider it my best friend like I do in my target gear, you know.
Okay.
Um, in a hunting situation, yeah, because it's all I have. I'm not gonna throw a rock at the deer. Bow's hanging in the stand with me. I know the sight tape's on. I know that arrow's gonna skip through a rock if I need it to. So if a turkey's at 25 yards, hung up at the decoys, and I have an arrow that's gonna kill a bison, I know all I have to do is put my pin on that target, and it's gonna go in the middle. All I know is the rest is up to me. Target, well, there's a lot more things that can go wrong.
Okay. And would you so going off that sense of comfort and being easier to draw, more comfortable to draw, is it safe to say that when you have a target bow, you're okay having a lighter draw weight for that comfort versus a hunting bow, where again you don't want to overdo yourself or put yourself in a situation where you have something that you can't actually do, but you want to try to pull the most weight that you're comfortable with. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It also depends the species you're hunting. Like when I go for turkey, I'll back it all the way down to like 60. Because you can kill a turkey with a 30-pound bow,
Okay.
especially if you put it in the right spot. So I'll back it down to 60, knowing that, okay, sometimes I'm on my knees. I hunt off the ground a lot, so I'm either crisscross or on my knees, where a lot of times a 72-pound bow you can't really pull back easily. You shake a lot when you do it, and of course, when you're eye level with the turkey, you need to be able to draw back slow. So I'll turn the poundage down. But when I'm going for something, we're following a very large bear this year on the property. Um, I know that I'm standing up in the tree stand. When you shoot competitive archery, you're standing up. So I know, okay, the situation's the exact same, other than the fact that I have to aim down a little bit. I know I'll be able to draw back a 72-pound bow slowly if I need to. Yet it'll still, do what to the bear that I need it to.
Give it the oomph. Yeah,
Yeah,
you know.
exactly.
So to build off that just a little bit, or to kind of just, I guess, a clarification. So obviously, pulling back a bow by backing your bow down, obviously, it's going to be a little bit easier to pull. Is there any level of forgiveness that comes with that, or I know bows are designed to work at their peaks, right? So if you have your bow maxed out at peak draw weight, peak draw length, it's going to be the most efficient version of that bow. What happens to your shot when you back that down? Is there a little forgiveness in the arrow, or does it actually hurt you a little bit?
Um, so that's tough to answer broadly because especially in the competitive world, there's so many different arrows and point weights, and if you have a broadhead on or not, what kind of broadhead you have on. It even comes down surprisingly to what kind of release you're shooting, where on that face does that release sit, what you're shooting at. So I find it also depends the cam and the bow. I know some bows don't perform as well at their peak, sometimes in the middle, vice versa. Most of the time they do perform the best at their peak. I'll admit that. Um, and then it's also what's comfortable. So I find the last bow I shot, the one I started having problems with. Obviously, I'm not going to name names, but
Sure.
um, I found once it was a 50 to 60-pound limb. I found with that specific cam that once I went above 56, 57 pounds, it felt like 56, 57 pounds. Um, but it was also lost its forgiveness a little bit. So I shot that bow mostly at 54 to 55 pounds. The new bow I'm shooting right now is the Super X from PSE. It has the EM cam on it because it's the most similar to the other cam I was shooting. I tried all three cams that were offered on it. Um, but the EM just clicked with me a little better. I'm shooting that bow at its max. It's 60 pounds. Um, I can shoot more arrows in a day with this 60-pound bow than I was able to with that 54-pound bow because it's
Okay.
just so much more comfortable.
Sure. So if someone has an option, like let's say someone knows that they fall between, so they're more of a 55 or a 65 pound draw length. Some companies offer those peak weights.
Hmm.
So a lot of companies will only offer, 50 to 60, 60 to 70, and even some bows will offer 70 to 80.
Hmm.
But there are a few companies that offer those half increments.
Yeah.
Do you recommend someone more specifically in the hunting world? Would you recommend them getting, say, a 65-pound limb over a 75-pound limb if they know they want to be 64, 65, or would you
Yeah.
still tell them to get the 70?
Um, I'd probably still say the 60 to 70,
Okay.
mainly because you're not going to lose any tunability or any consistency or forgiveness if you're sitting in the middle of the cam or limb.
Okay.
The reason being is because again I'm using the same bow for my turkey setup, my deer setup, and my bear setup. I can back it down to 60 if I need to. Normally I would say for deer I'm like a 65, 67 pound shooter just because
Okay.
when I'm in the tree stand, you have your harness on, that gets in the way. Some you're not always aiming straight. Sometimes you're canted to the side a little bit, off the side, or there's a couple times where I had to hang off the side of the tree stand to get uh my pin on the deer. Um, that was usually what I'm most comfortable with is 65 to 67. Um, I can do way more, I can do way less, but it's just in this situation. When I go for bear, I have it at 72 right now.
Okay.
When I go for turkey, I have it at 60.
Okay.
So I think the 60 to 70, or 71, 72. Sometimes depending on the scale you have, it says more or less.
Sure.
It gives you a little more option. Now, if you're doing like the 50 to 60, it's the same thing. Usually, it gives you a little more. I don't want to say because there's also a lot of if you look at like arrows when you're tuning an arrow, it'll tell you are you shooting a 60 to 70 pound bow or are you shooting a 50 to 60 pound bow. There's no in between. So now you got to do all this figuring
Right.
out math. What are you? You know,
Yeah.
are you shooting 50? Then you got to go scale your bow. Okay, different. There, I've drawn back scales that are 5 pounds apart.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, it's just a little more, I'd say standard 50 to 60 or 60 to 70.
Okay. Now we're coming up on an hour, and I want to be mindful of your time.
Hmm.
We had just a couple more quicker, I guess, topics to go over if you have the
Not all
time to
night.
go.
Not
Okay.
all
And
night.
do you have anything else to ask or go over as far as the bow builds are concerned?
No.
All right, cool. And I guess if we can make it really, really quick, is there really much of a difference in the components you use, other than obviously like target archers are going to use longer stabilizers. Hunting, we don't really have that luxury. You want to be more compact.
Yeah.
Outside of that, is there really any huge difference to the components that you're using on your bow?
Yeah, I mean, both my bows are different. I'm even using different releases.
Okay,
The releases I use are a little, with target archery, it's a pretty tiny release. It's the Fulcrum Flex Mini, because I have small hands also. But it's the same hand drawing back every time. Whereas with the bigger release, sometimes I have thin gloves on, sometimes I have thick gloves on, sometimes I have no gloves at all. So it gives you a little more idea. Even the scope I'm using is different. When I'm shooting target archery, I'm shooting a floating sticker on a lens. When I'm shooting hunting, it's a 2-pin up pin. Like you said, stabilizers are smaller. My rests are different. So when I'm shooting target archery, it's a fixed blade rest. When I'm hunting, it's a drop away, just so I know it's out of the way, since the situations are so different. The peep's different. I shoot a bigger peep. I usually like to see a decent amount outside of my housing
okay,
with hunting. So if I do have gloves on and my peeps are canted off to the left or right, I can still see my pin. It's still going to go in the same spot.
sure.
Um, so yeah, I would say everything is different when it comes to hunting and target.
Okay, so we're gonna side table that, and if you're kind enough to join us for another chat someday, maybe we'll do a deeper dive into the specific arrow builds because I feel like we could have a pretty long conversation on that alone. Now you've already kind of touched on the arrow a little bit, so just quickly, we don't have to go into the specifics of how you build it, FOC, and all that good stuff, but what are the differences between the arrows that you're shooting for competition versus hunting?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, I'm mainly an indoor archer, so I'm worried about it catching the 10 ring, so I'm not going to shoot a thin arrow like I would with hunting, because if I'm off by a tiny bit, I can miss the 10, which is in Vegas, your competition's gone, you know.
Sure.
So a thicker arrow, pretty fat arrow.
Or she thick that.
Yeah, exactly. A pretty big arrow helps. Heavy, I shoot pretty heavy arrows for indoor. I have a It's a 250 grain head. Um, the whole arrow itself is probably 800 grains.
That's your target arrow.
Because I'm not worrying about speed. I'm worrying about it
Oh,
being consistent. I don't want too
okay.
much flex in it, and it's an aluminum arrow.
Okay, that I knew.
Yeah, big fletchings, long, not tall, but long, about 4.5 inch fletchings, stiff fletchings. I mean, I have literally got like scars on my pinky from pulling arrows out, and my hand slips, and it cuts me like a knife sometimes. Whereas hunting, I'm shooting a micro arrow, less wind drag, less meat drag, I guess you could say. There's less to hit the animal. It's lighter, yet it allows you to get the weight where you want it. FOC wise, it's easier to tune. And I only shoot, I think, 170 grains, 175 grains off the front, 100 grain broadhead with a 75 grain half cert, and then just pretty small vanes so they don't make too much of a fluttering noise in the wind, because that's what deer do move from. And then a pretty small knock if I can. But
Okay,
yeah,
and
the arrows are so different.
yeah, and for those of you listening, when that don't know, when Kevin refers to the half cert, it's essentially a traditional insert. Basically, goes all the way into the arrow, so it like it sounds, it gets inserted into the front of the arrow, and then the field point gets screwed into that. An outsert is mostly on the outside of the arrow, and it kind of tucks over or cups over the arrow. But a half out is a kind of a combination of the two. It has a sleeve that goes inside of it, and then a little kind of collar that cups over the end of the arrow. And instead of it strengthening like an inch or two on the front of the arrow, its main job is to protect the tip of your arrow to protect against impact. Which
I
obviously
actually have
is
a question because that was actually counterintuitive. For someone like me who doesn't really know too much about competition shooting archery, you would think that you would want a flatter shooting arrow for target shooting because then you have less variability with the movement of the arrow over longer distances. Is that something that you do when you're doing outdoor target shooting, when you do like 3D targets, like you were talking about the tack shoot, or is this something that you just do when you're indoors at fixed distances?
So that's just mainly indoors is like these heavy arrows. Like you're not getting a lot of FPS out of it, but they're hitting like they're the same hole every time. Like there's one hole in each target. Whereas if I'm gonna build a bow for 3D archery, I'll still shoot a pretty fat arrow because you're still trying to catch a scoring ring. But I'll make it a lot lighter. So like a carbon arrow with only 100 grains up front, 65, 70 pound target bow. Because the thing is, you don't know the distance. So if your arrow's flatter shooting, 40 might hit the same as 42. So if that 3D's target's at 38 and it's at 40, you're still gonna catch that ring.
So you actually like more movement. You like more drop. It's more accurate for you as a person who's shooting a sight tape that, when you sight to 42, you're actually going to be making sure that you're getting that extra half inch of drop that will actually put you in the center of the X. And instead of, if you're shooting, like you said, a flatter, lighter arrow, your 40-yard shot might be at the top of the circle and your 45-yard shot might be at the bottom of the X circle. So there's
Yeah.
there's
So
there's too much play in there.
exactly. So when I'm worrying about outdoor, FIDA archery, which is like same distance every time, whether it's that or 3D, I want a fast, flat arrow because then I don't have to worry about being exactly on. Whereas indoor, it doesn't matter how slow or fast your arrow is. It's just as long as it's comfortable with your bow, as long as it's like clicking with your bow tune, and it's hitting middle every time. Like my buddy, I'm decent friends with my buddy Bodie Turner, who won Vegas at I think it was 14 or 15 years old a couple years ago. When he won Vegas, afterwards we watched his bow go through paper with a 2 inch left tear. So his bow is basically not tuned. I don't know exactly what the story was behind it because I'm the same way. I don't really try to. The only thing I tune my bow for is myself when it comes to indoor. If my arrow's coming out sideways, but it's still hitting middle every time, it doesn't matter.
and there's also some physics going on there too,
Mhm.
right? there is a trade-off, pros and cons to the faster arrows and the slower arrows. It's almost like a car. Doesn't matter what the car looks like. It doesn't matter what the shape is. If you're just driving 20 miles an hour down the road, any car can handle that. And
Hmm.
that's to compare the fatter, heavier arrow for indoor. Because the heavier arrow, like you said, it doesn't flex as much and it's slowing it down a little bit and you're not getting the speed out of it. It doesn't need to be as perfectly aerodynamic, let's say, to control the arrow and to get it where you want. Now, the trade off is when you speed up your arrow and you go to a more hunting specific arrow, that arrow, the shape of your arrow, the way it interacts with the air is more important. So there's that trade-off. Like you're saying, you don't mind a slower arrow for competition, and that makes sense because the slower arrow is going to be easier to control. Same thing with a vehicle. Everyone's seen the horror stories of a motorcycle going 100 and some odd miles down the highway and getting speed wobble. That doesn't happen at 40 miles an hour, you know. So just something to kind of take into consideration as you're building those arrows as well. If we have nothing else to bring up about the arrow specific stuff, kind of wrapping it up here, we kind of just wanted to see if you have any insight or input on some common mistakes that are made by both beginners, but also what would be considered a veteran shooter. You know, because I know I make mistakes, and you know, I'm sure we all make mistakes from time to time. So, what are common mistakes you see from both level shooters?
When it comes to target archery first, your setting. So I find a lot of people I talk to, especially at our range, and just people on Instagram, I get a lot of DMs asking how we step up at Vegas and just shoot the same scores that we do at home. Um, it's putting yourself in the situations first. So I think the main mistake people make with target archery is shooting at home alone or with their buddy that they shoot with every other day anyway. Um, Use those local leagues and competitions as a tool. Almost like as I said with the TAC, it's there for you. It's not expensive, you know. There's a lot of leagues that are free. There's a lot of competitions that are free. Like just get-togethers just to get used. Shoot with people you've never seen before in your life. You know. That's why I like our league because it's so chaotic. It's like
It
there's
really
no
is.
timer. There's no timer, but people are running on and off the line. It's like there's people talking in the back, laughing in the back, and half the time there's new people every year too.
And they're hackling you, man. They like, especially when you're friends with the guys that are behind you at the club, they don't leave you alone.
Exactly. So it's like there's that, put yourself in those situations before, you step up to the home plate, the big home plate, because it's like when you do, it's like I said with the Mike Tyson saying it, you have that plan until you get the punch in the face. The punch in the face is the cameras. The other 1,000 people in Vegas, no one realizes there's 1,400 people just having fun that aren't even shooters, just watching you. Um,
Wow.
and when there is only 100 people on the pro line at a time, you're one out of 100 archers. There's times where you have an eye on you at all times, and a lot of people that's a tough pill to swallow. So if you get used to having an eye on you at all times, it just becomes a thing. And with hunting, like we were talking about before, with getting not just expanding your comfort zone, but getting ready for any situation, it kind of crosses over into that too.
Okay.
I think the main mistake I see with hunting, in my opinion, is the whole broadhead situation. A lot of people fall in this black hole of broadheads. Um, and you didn't, as I know, I saw you wince at that. You didn't go very deep in the black hole at all.
No, no.
You just kind of like, if you shot a broadhead and you had to spend more than an hour tuning it to your other arrows, you just kind of threw it to the side and tried a different one.
Yeah, can I be honest with you? I simply, not sorry to cut you off. I
No,
basically, when it came to my broad, I know that I have the personality of once I grasp onto something, I go into black holes. I did it with the bow, I did it with heavy FOC arrows, I did it with everything. So when it came to broadheads, I found a type of broadhead I wanted, for example, like a single bevel. I found one that shot well. I found maybe another one or two other ones that I liked, and I just rotate between them and I called it a day.
mhm.
You know, so sorry, but this, yeah.
Yeah, so it's exactly like a lot of people are against like the whole mechanical broadhead. There's so many mechanical broadheads. Um, So it's like, for instance, I fell down the black hole of like just again trying to figure out my broadhead when I was a little younger, so I had a slow shooting bow too, which puts a lot more problems
Restrictions.
to
Yeah.
it. Yeah. Um, I was shooting a fixed blade broadhead, and I remember the first deer I shot was with a Muzzy fixed blade broadhead because it was cheap and I wasn't shooting past 20 yards at a pizza box, so it didn't matter anyway. And I wasn't good enough to realize that it wasn't going where my field points were. And I killed a deer. I got a deer or two with it. Then once I started figuring out a little more about mechanicals, and I started liking the idea of mechanicals. I think I started out with it was a Rage, I think it was, and it shot good, but it was still like an inch or two off. Dude, I spent so much time trying to tune that broadhead that I got the broadhead to hit with my sight tape. Then when I put a field tip back on, it was off by 5, 6 inches left or right. So it got to the point where I get a arrow built like I want it to a field point, right? I get that tuned. I get a sight tape for it. If I screw on a broadhead that does not agree with that sight tape, I take that broadhead off, I put it in a drawer and say, okay, maybe it'll work on my next arrow setup. I'm just gonna find a different one.
Okay.
It's I think there's a lot better things to focus on when it comes to not just setup but what form. You're taking a lot of time away from yourself. Um, so like I found sever broadheads when I think it was my third year of hunting, and I just found that it was 2 years, maybe a year into competitive archery, so I was spending so much time behind the target bow that I was just like I didn't really want to touch my hunting bow until a month before hunting season. So I found the last thing I wanted to do was spend a week with a broadhead. So I was like, I tried the severs, I screwed it on, hit the same as my field point. It wasn't too stiff of a broadhead, so I knew it was gonna open no matter what. Ever since then, it was the kind of thing where like severs were just always like, okay, I need to tune a new hunting arrow. Field tips, sight tape. Okay, let me check my sever broadhead. Step back to 80 yards with it. If it goes in the group at 80 yards in 2 shots, it's just kind of like, okay, it's going to do the same at every other distance.
Sure. And to just clarify, every single one of us here uses a different broadhead. I think all three of us probably have 2 or 3 or 4 different types of broadheads. And the truth is, at the end of the day, as long as your broadhead hits where you're aiming, any broadhead on the market is going to kill an animal,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
All of us have had great experiences with some broadheads, and all of us have had not great experience with
yeah,
other broadheads, and that is kind of what shapes our opinions on certain things, right? But most importantly, before anything else, is shot placement. So if you have proper shot placement, any broadhead is going to do the job, right? And some people believe that you want to have a different broadhead for, for those bad shots or, a deer that moves. And some people don't worry about that. And whichever way you go, that's okay, as long as at the end of the day, you're confident in what you're using. Out of
yeah,
everything that we've talked about today, practice, preparation, planning ahead, everything is about building the confidence that you feel that you are the best shot in the world when you step up to the line to shoot a target, to shoot a 3D target, to shoot a deer out of a tree stand. That's my opinion. Without confidence, we have nothing.
And that was another point that you brought up when people say, I'm going to get a broadhead. That will be good for when I make a bad shot on that deer. If you stopped worrying about that broadhead, you wouldn't make that bad shot on that deer, So it was like when I screw on a broadhead, if it hits the same, after 30 arrows, I'll take the broadheads off, put the field points back on, step out to 100 yards, pound out 80 arrows at 100 yards until I'm too tired and just not having fun anymore. That's it. That's it.
Sure. I actually heard I heard something pretty interesting on Instagram yesterday. And it was a really crazy perspective because it matched up with something I heard a couple days ago. And I was talking to someone and they said, like, yeah, when you shoot a deer in the heart, they're going to die. But a deer hit in the heart can go 100, 200,
Yeah,
300 yards
absolutely.
just simply off adrenaline alone.
Hmm.
But if you double lung a deer, they can only go as far as it takes for the lungs to fill up.
Yes.
Now, I saw what I saw yesterday, and I think it was actually the one of the guys, a part of Lone Wolf Custom Gear, and he was saying that I think it's the son of the owner. He said that his father taught him growing up that um, to shoot back. We all try to crowd the shoulder to try to get a heart shot or what we consider like the prime shot. Absolutely. The best shot, in my opinion, the best placement is where the heart meets the lungs, the veins. If you sever the top of those veins, you get double lungs, veins, and heart. But the problem is it's actually a risky shot because it is up front with all of the shoulder muscles and the leg muscles. If you take a second to just get out of that thought process and aim another inch or two back, behind the heart and shoot for the lungs. If you miss a little left, you're going to hit the heart. If you miss a little right, you're going to shoot the liver. Either way, it's a dead deer. But if you aim for the heart and you hit a little left, you are shoulder all day. And there are only a handful of setups that are going to be effective with that kind of shot. So maybe instead of worrying about what broadhead we shoot, maybe we change the idea of where we want to aim on the animal that we're shooting at.
Yeah, I mean, obviously don't do it because it's illegal everywhere, but you could kill a deer basically just as fast with a field point as you can with a broadhead. The thing that a broadhead does is it just helps with the tracking part of it, so blood tracking. And if you do make a little bit poorer of a shot, a 2-inch broadhead is going to catch the lungs. But if you put a field point through the middle of two lungs and it's a pass through, that deer's going to go maybe 10 yards further than if you had an expandable or a fixed blade broadhead.
Okay, cool. Now, we're just about done to wrap up here. I want to ask you your one piece of advice for beginners and your one piece of advice for veterans. But before we get there, I know you've had a little bit of your own little side quest venture going on here. You've just started a Bonnie Brook fly fishing company recently, right? I know you've taken a couple trips up to Maine and Canada, and you're looking to do, I think, another trip down south, if I'm not mistaken, or you did a trip down south. So why don't you go ahead and tell the listeners a little bit about your company, what it's all about, and what you got going for them.
Yeah, so I started fly fishing when I was about 9, and it's oddly enough a pretty just as similar as the story as the whole archery thing. I started fly fishing when I was 9, got addicted to it. When I was like 14, maybe 13, I started tying flies. Sold all my conventional gear to pay for more fly fishing gear and tying gear. And ever since then, I had wanted to start making like a fly tying company just from other people that I idolized and. Um, then about a year ago, I finally got to the point where I was like, okay, it's probably about time to start. So I made Bonnie Brook Fly Co., which we mainly, I believe in the idea of getting new flies out. I think a lot of companies have mostly flies that are just your generic, like traditional patterns, which are great. I fish them all the time, the generic traditional. And yeah, at some point, of course, we're going to offer that. But right now, I think we're mainly, we got a new fly coming out on the 28th, which I don't know when this is going to be posted. But today's Monday. It's coming out Wednesday. Uh, we had been working on that fly since, I believe, mid-April. That's a while ago. It's August. It's August 2026 today.
Is that one of those flies that you were testing out in Canada or Maine or
Yeah,
wherever you were?
so
Okay.
we got the fly in April. It was basically just a lot of sketching in April, drawing it down, because a lot of times it's harder to get on a hook what you want until you have a bearing of sizing and proportions and what materials you're going to use. So I did the sketching for about 3 weeks in April. Then once May came along, when we really started hatching down on just actually fishing too, I started putting it on hooks, which that's when some of the problems I think I had 10 to 15 different prototypes. I knew exactly kind of like what I wanted it based around. So I had about 10 to 15 similar prototypes. When you put it on a hook, I would say 12 to 15 of those prototypes are scratched off.
Well,
So we started tied all of May, just had a box of prototypes, just every day we were fishing different prototypes. Then I'd say mid to late May is when we got exactly what we were looking for, perfect proportions, got what, good hook size too. We were trying to figure out hook size. Then we started out on like a size 1.0 hook and ended on like a size 2. So the hook was smaller than we initially thought it was going to be.
Yep.
Um, then the main thing after that was to um, not just test out the fly itself, castability, how it moves in the water, um, but can a fisherman go from moving water to still water and still get the same reaction out of the fly, whether the fish wants it or not? Then we had to worry about colors also. So what kind of colors were we going to work with? So then we went to Maine a couple times, and we made a trip specifically to Canada just to test out this prototype for a week, and it went perfect. I mean, exactly how we needed it. So since Canada, which was in early July. It's like mid-August now. We've mainly just been working on the marketing aspect, still fishing it, getting product photos, um, and inventory. So then, I think we just finished getting inventory about a week ago. So then we just finished up some small things with the marketing, and those will be coming out on Wednesday. But it's definitely, I don't want to say the most work we've put into a fly, uh, but the most, I guess, heart we've put into a fly, sort of,
Okay,
because
I like that.
I fished just this fly for literally 2 months straight now. I tied nothing else on so far.
That's
Um,
awesome.
and alone, I've probably caught about 150 to 200 fish on this fly between
Okay.
between the three colors that are gonna be available.
So you heard it first here, ladies and gentlemen. This fly is effective. Plenty of fish caught over
Hmm.
just what 2 or 3 fishing trips. And I know Kevin, you're excited to get that out. Where can
Yeah.
they buy? Where can they buy these flies?
So it'll be at BonnybrookFlyco.com. Originally, this fly was gonna be coming out mid-September, but we moved it up a little bit because, of course, we're already working on some more prototypes. It is gonna be a bonefish permit and like tarpon based prototype, mainly because we've got some trips based around that coming up next year. So we're hoping to get those out about around April.
Okay, that's awesome. And before we wrap up, you want to plug your Instagram, Facebook, anywhere people can find you if they're looking for you?
Yeah, so my the best Instagram to reach me at is just my normal Instagram. It's just my name, Kevin Kleindienst. Shoot me a DM if you need to about anything, any questions about what was on this podcast. I post not recently because I haven't been training too much recently, but you'll see a lot of stories and photos of me training, how I do at the competitions, how hunting season's going, what deer I'm following. And again, always send me a DM if needed.
Awesome. And I think we've taken up enough time here, but I think based on what we've talked about today, I think the number one piece of advice you would give to just about any shooter is practice, practice, practice. Slow is fast, fast is slow. Practice how you're going to hunt, practice how you're going to compete, and you'll see your results
Yep.
within time.
Yeah, I think um the main quote that I've been going by since I heard it. I heard this quote about a year into like hard training, so I think I was about 16. It was don't train like you want to win, train like you're gonna win.
I love that.
If you train like you want to win, you're of course you're gonna train hard, but you're gonna get that, like from Mike Tyson, you're gonna get that punch in the face. Where if you train like you're gonna win, that confidence is gonna be a lot higher.
I love that. So,
Mhm.
with that being said, I don't think there's anything else. Kevin, I hope that you're willing to join us in the future. Angelo
Yeah,
and
of
I were
course.
talking about actually maybe doing like a salmon fishing trip next year, and we don't want to give away the location, obviously, but our family properties are very close to each other, and the trout fishing is phenomenal. So I think we're gonna have a lot of opportunities to put out some content, some fly fishing training videos and stuff like
100%.
that. We want to thank you for joining us. We want to thank you for your time. And we want to thank the listeners for making it this far. Remember, if you like what you heard today, if you have any questions or anything you want to hear in the future, please leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and Google. Please, it really helps us out, and it's going to help us out coming up with some stuff that you want to hear in the future.